Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Leah Treshnecki and I will be the host with an incredible panel of guests today who I'm excited to have introduce themselves. But first, just to orient everyone to the topic, we are going to be talking about all things data sovereignty. And hopefully you can bear with me as I take you guys on that journey. I've been literally across the entire continent in the last 2 weeks. I was in Istanbul, then I was in Phuket, and I brought some lovely cold back with me. So hopefully as we cross borders, you guys can cross the chasm of trying to understand my voice today. But with that, I am really excited to introduce my panel today. What we wanted to do with the data sovereignty conversation is recognize that there's a lot of different facets to understand because, unlike a strictly technical conversation, this is going to be a conversation that spans contracts, vendor relationships, public-private partnerships. There's a lot to cover here. So we had to bring the best of the best together. To start that, we called on our good friends at IDC to really lay that macro level trend analysis down for us. So Archana has joined us from IDC. Could you go ahead and give us a brief introduction about who you are and what you cover?
Definitely. Thank you, Leah, for having me in this panel and discussing such an important and strategic topic. It's something we at IDC look at from a market intelligence perspective quite a lot, and there is so much of emotions running into this topic. So it would be good to demystify some of that today. And what a great travel story. I would love to connect with you afterwards. I was so jealous until you said you got a cold, so feel better.
It's just par for the course. I got to go down to the Basilica in Istanbul, which is like an aqueduct repository of water that was built in the 500s. Who can complain when they get to do something like that? Which, by the way, there was an entire James Bond movie scene filmed down there, and there's an ancient Medusa head. I can't complain. I can't. It was very, very cool. Speaking of very, very cool, I have an old friend of mine on the webinar today. Mr. Edwin is joining us. He is our field CTO for EMEA. Edwin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thank you, Leah. Great to have you over on my continent. It's not my property, but hey, I'm always trying to get people across and experience things there. So yeah, Edwin Edward, field CTO for me. I've been with him for 9 years. I'm an explorer and translator for 30 plus years. You can see the gray hair, so we'll fit in nicely. But yeah, anything that's cybersecurity related, and I'm now more branching into like governance, risk, and compliance. So that's also why I like this topic. And so let's dive into that. But hey, you said about me having a friend. I also took a friend with me from the Netherlands. So same name even in the surname. So Edwin Moral, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really delighted to join it. I'm Edwin Moral. I'm the CISO of the VNRG of the Netherlands. We're one of the 25 safety regions. We manage the fire department in our region and also a bit of public health. And yeah, resilience and maturity and also compliance. It's all about our organization. We had a breach 5 years ago, so yeah, we know what it means now.
You definitely do, and I think for an organization with such an important mission, that had to really be shocking to the system, right? So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your organization, what you guys stay focused on, and therefore why data resilience is probably really important.
Yeah, we are a crisis organization. We have to rely on our data. When there is an incident, whatever incident ever, we have to rely on our data. It gets us on the data terminals in the fire trucks, and they made a plan of approach in the trucks. So the data that is in, they can improve the impact on the incident. It speeds up to handle the course of that. And yeah, compliance data. Yeah, it's on a heavy scale. Yeah, we have to be mature in that. We were breached a few years ago, so yeah, we know what it is, and we know also what it is to work without the data. So having the data and staying having the data, yeah, it's the most important thing for us.
I think something that the other Edwin and I have at least observed over the last couple of years is that cyber resilience, right? So you mentioned a breach. I think that that has kind of raised the profile of thinking about resilience across people, process, technology. And as a result, it now, I hope, makes more organizations prepared for other kinds of resilience questions like changes to data sovereignty laws, geopolitical changes. We're going to talk about that quite a bit today. But I'm hoping that those on the webinar audience can listen to what you have to say, especially because you know firsthand what it looks like when things go wrong here. So I'm hoping that we can kind of get folks to be a little bit more proactive instead of being that next news story, right? There's definitely a lot to be said for no news is good news in this front. So to break this topic down a bit, we as a group kind of talked about what we would want to say today. And it all ended up kind of moving around these 4 pillars. So today, this is what we're going to be talking about. The first is looking at how you can gain control and be confident, right? When it comes to data resilience in an age of data sovereignty law changes, that has to mean knowing where your data is, what contracts are beholden to it, where that data is going to flow to. And there's a lot of changes in the market that we're going to cover that give you things to think about when it comes to how confident you are that you can control your data. Now, one of those levers that's getting pulled is regulatory compliance changes. So we're going to talk a bit about what's been moving around from a trend perspective. And as Edwin mentioned, him and I are both kind of GRC wonks. So we were really excited to cover that for you guys today. And then we're going to talk a bit about the technical side of things, how you can build portability by design into your architectures and gain that control back over your data. And the final piece is just looking at what maturity does look like. Edwin mentioned that it's really important to his organization that there is a mature approach to data resilience. We're going to talk more about what that looks like today as well. So if you guys have any questions for this panel, please drop them in the chat, the Q&A function, whatever makes sense for you, and we will be there answering on the chat. We'll probably also stay on at the end of the webinar in case there's additional questions. So just dump those questions in there. We're really excited to connect with you guys today. And again, hopefully my voice stays connected so that you guys can keep actually hearing what I'm saying. So the first piece that we're going to cover is that control, right? How do you gain control over your data and build that confidence into every level of your organization, from Edwin's level all the way down to an administrator? So Archana, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of why data sovereignty is becoming this heightened conversation and therefore why organizations are looking to gain better control?
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I hope you get a sip of water, Leah. And I think before I start, just want to give a big shout out to Edwin Morale. It doesn't get more real than this, right? You guys, first line of service, it's what you do is making the real difference. So it's fantastic. And also the other thing is that you talked about the breach, right? I think our survey shows that 92% of organizations have experienced this, and our tongue-in-cheek response is that the other 8% either doesn't know or are not telling the truth, right? So it's something that all organizations are going through as well. So you're not alone, but I feel the pinch. It's a big issue when it comes to business continuity. And I think over time, cyber attacks have become more like an attack on a psychology of an organization, right? How do you react quickly becomes quite important. So well done on dealing with it and making that a top agenda. So yeah, so we've at IDC focused a lot on sovereignty as a broader topic, right? And one of the biggest pieces within that sovereignty, whether you talk about operational sovereignty, whether you talk about skills and energy sovereignty, there's so much that goes into it. The core aspect is very much data sovereignty. And today, based on the conversations we have with the C-suites, it's almost pre-compliance, right? Organizations are thinking about sovereignty almost as a pre-compliance aspect. And one of the key reasons is because of a lot of geopolitical uncertainties in the last 12 to 18 months that has made organizations sit up and think about this a lot more seriously, because there's a lot of tension and conflict among different national legal systems, where there's the US Cloud Act versus the GDPR versus Schrems II. So there are so many different national legal systems that are conflicting with each other. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And one of the biggest penny drop moment for organizations has been this idea that, what about vendor lockout, right? Because there is so much of dependency on a lot of technology. It's for organizations, their IT spend is one of the biggest spends, right? So there's so much of dependency on technology for day-to-day business operations that any level of geopolitical uncertainties can have an impact in terms of lockout. So the idea of lock-in and concentration risk has been very well understood since the early days of the cloud, but it's only now that organizations are realizing, because of geopolitical uncertainties, the fear and the challenge around lockout. So vendor lockout is one of the biggest aspects for heightened focus on data sovereignty. The second big piece is rising data sensitivity, right? We live in an AI everywhere era. Organizations are looking at their data very much as a currency, right? So how am I going to be more in control of my own data, because that defines my destiny? So how much control do I have? How much of my data IP I can protect? How can I use that data when I want in a most cost-efficient way, as well as in a compliant and protected way? So rising data sensitivity combined with geopolitical uncertainties increase the focus on data sovereignty. And the third aspect that's connected very much is this growing reliance on third-party infrastructure. And in many cases, it's a lot of focused vendors in one country, right? For a lot of organizations, they rely on these big three public cloud providers who are all headquartered in the US. So that growing reliance on that third-party infrastructure, all of these have together some kind of a melting pot that made organizations to sit up and look at this a little bit more seriously in the last 12 months. If you move a bit forward, and you know, all that heightened sensitivity is not just they're talking about this, right? It's because it's real. So we asked organizations, if you look at your entire environment, where is business data growing fastest? And there's a lot to take on this slide. So the percentages that you see are the percentage of responses. So 27% of organizations have said that software as a service, SaaS environment, is their fastest growing environment when it comes to business data growth. Second one is container and cloud native workloads. And when I was looking at this, it really drove home the point that if you look at containers and cloud native as the second fastest growing, it's growing from a very small base, because cloud native world is a newer world. But if you look at the SaaS environment, it's already so big, so massive, and yet it's growing so fast, and that goes to say something, right? And SaaS has always represented this breath of fresh air for organizations. It's been one of the first steps for digital transformation. And when it comes to infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, organizations are a lot more conscious. They realize that they're porting their data onto something that's beyond their control. But SaaS is so seamless, and it's just so focused on interface, and a lot of distributed number of employees are using it. It just doesn't feel, you don't realize the risk involved in that. So a lot of initial sovereignty focus was very much on my public cloud infrastructure footprint is growing, but that's still a very small portion compared to SaaS. So I think that's how I would read it. SaaS, in spite of being such a big environment, it's one of the biggest cloud environments, right? Yet it's an area that more organizations have cited as business data growing fastest. So it's one of the big exposure points for organizations that are serious about sovereignty, and it must be one of the first areas that they need to look at to resolve some of these issues. And then the data loss fears cannot get more real than this, right? So not only is SaaS representing an environment where data is growing the fastest, Microsoft M365 is pretty much everywhere, like 70–80% of organizations are using it. If you look at the Teams usage on a daily basis, it runs in hundreds of millions, right? So it's a huge number. And it's one of the biggest environments where organizations have cited tremendous concerns around data loss when it comes to all of their SaaS environments. And Google Workspace is pretty big as well, particularly in the academic segment. But then it's M365 that's a lot more prevalent. And if you can see, it's so much higher in terms of data loss fears, because organizations are, it's so distributed. There are so many different applications within that M365 suite, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's OneDrive, whether it's Teams environment. I was talking to a legal organization, and they had to retain data for 37 years, they said. And some of their initial conversations with the customers, if it was on patent or something, was actually on the Teams environment. And it could just get lost, right, if they're not thinking about all of their M365 environment a lot more holistically. So I think the data loss fears are real, particularly in the SaaS environment, and within that, particularly M365.
I think that piece of it is so key, how reliant organizations are on something like M365. And one of the things I was looking at in preparing for this webinar, again, you know, we relate data sovereignty and cyber resilience in terms of elevating that critical importance of these workloads, right? So this is what Microsoft observed that they published in their Digital Defender report for this year. This is one of the best reports that we have on telemetry data as it relates to how these most important workloads get attacked by bad actors. So they said the most common and complete kill chain pattern is attackers gain Entra credentials via some sort of spray and replay tactic. And again, you can read more about that in their report. They move laterally through authentication or service principal abuse, right? So not fulfilling zero trust principles, least privilege access in your architecture. And then they escalate into Microsoft 365 for data theft and extortion. That is the most common kill chain. And here's what's scary is it's not just like, you know, the social engineering for a top level person that they gain access through. Identity attacks in general have risen 32% in the first half of 2025, according to Microsoft, and workload identities. So think of applications, scripts, service principals are the new frontier. They are now making up a meaningful share of breaches that used to just be human accounts. So I think a lot of this goes to show that all of these SaaS services, they may seem like they function in different ways, but the cloud is all connected. And if you remove the integrity of that data or access to that data, the confidentiality of that data then becomes exploited. And that's how these bad actors are able to be so successful. So, you know, I think that just hopefully provides a lot of credibility for what this data is saying, that organizations are thinking about the data loss of these applications top of mind. And there's just so many bad things that can happen to good data, as one of Edwin and I's colleagues, Rick Vanover, always says. So Edwin, speaking of kind of how Veeam thinks about this topic, something that the EMEA team has been trying to really educate the market on is what data sovereignty even is, because I think we know, but a lot of folks maybe don't have it top of mind, that data sovereignty is more than just where your data is located. Especially as an American, that becomes the topic of conversation. Well, don't worry, we have, you know, an Azure repo in such and such country. That is only just the start of the conversation. So Edwin, do you want to talk a bit about how Team EMEA is breaking this problem down for our customers?
Yeah, if we come into customers, it's all about the technical discussion first. So where's the data stored? Yeah, we have stored it in X, Y, or Z, or in that data center or in that cloud. Hold on, reverse. Because of course, it's data, and also what I say, especially, and I kind of already mentioned it also, that data becomes so valuable. I compare today with oxygen. If the oxygen flow through the organization is being interrupted and you stop it, people start suffocating, literally now. That's also why I always try to stop that discussion at that moment in time and think, okay, roll back. It's a strategy, because first you have to have the data strategy. So where does it sit? Where does it flow through, to, and on? But also who can access it? And especially the last one. And there's also what we were hinting about. All those attacks, also what Microsoft is tracking that, and also what IDC did in their reports. It's about taking over an identity. Because as a hacker, fortunately, the white hat hacker, it's about taking control of an identity. If you can take control of Edwin Morale's identity, and I don't do any stupid stuff working in night, I might be even working at night, but staying in boundaries, that all of the tools that are out there, they're all thinking about, hey, do you use a tool that we never want you to use? Or do you do things out of context or out of the time? If I don't do all those things, all those security tools will not see that I am accessing data, that I can even control the data. That's where I always want to think people about, okay, data sovereignty. So data, where does it sit? Where does it flow through? Who has access to it? But then also operational. Who's working with the data? How are support incidents running through? Do you have a break glass if something goes wrong? Some people will say, we just reset the passwords from the accounts we think they breached, instead of going for the golden buzzer and say, reset everything. So the golden ticket there, reset all accounts, and then start enabling one by one. Because we have seen organizations, especially also from a Cobra acquisition, I talked with Magnus with her, and he's right in the field as a negotiator. They have seen customers saying, no, only those 3 accounts, because otherwise it has too much impact. 12 hours later, everything was encrypted again, but even more heavily. And that's also why I go and hop over to like the technical part there. It's about thinking in a broader thing, because the data is fueling your services. So how is your continuity of that service? If the data is not there, it's nice that we still have access to the cloud, that everyone can see it. But if there's no data in it, it becomes kind of useless, right? So ability to use that post and disconnect, but also the ability to access the data. And that's where a lot of that fear also comes from. Like I saw like the previous slide, the fear of losing data. But we can, I think, even connect to that the fear of not being able to access the data. And that's kind of a 1-1. So 1 + 1 is 3, because if the data is not there, you cannot access it, you have double trouble. But if one of those tools happen, and we have seen that, because it's not just exfiltration, it's not about encryption, it's also about locking you out of your system. You still have everything running, everyone can do business with you, but you have no control anymore. And then you have to think about the ability to like have an exit or migrate out strategy or moving around. And that's also about sovereignty. It's not about, okay, we shield it, nobody can touch it, we have it in our own data center. Hold on, we started AI, right? Everyone wants to use AI, generic AI, going through what does AI need? Data, lots of data. It's like that hungry wolf, you will just feed it and it keeps eating. And that's also why we come into legal, kind of, because it's that initial contract, court orders for disclosure, disconnecting power. That's all also tying into the whole thing about data sovereignty. Can you have someone ordering you to show the data, or even order your service provider to give the data to the court, but also locking you out? Like, we don't like you, we took an order and you're now out of the system. And that's also why we have the whole thing about not lock in, but lock out. All of a sudden, you still have your systems, you still have your data, but you have no access anymore. Goodbye.
I think you've sufficiently scared everyone in the audience. I didn't realize that this was our Halloween episode or Semaine episode, but here we are.
Thanksgiving, so I will be nice from now on.
Yes. But look, I think so much of how we tackle these things is bringing light to the problem. Edwin, I'd love to chat with you a bit about this, because I think when we look at data sovereignty, Edwin brought up a lot of those questions. So ultimately, it comes down to where your data is stored, how the data flows, who has access to it, and where is the legal jurisdiction, right? Those are the core questions. So do you think in your organization 2 years ago, the average person in your IT or security department would have an answer for any of this of like, oh, with M365, it means this and this. Oh, with Azure, it means this. Do you think anyone thought about this 2 years ago?
No. 2 years ago, even yet. And as Edwin Weideman already said, he hits the nail on the head. It's all about the sovereignty. We started it up with a triangle with people and process, strategy and technology. It all comes together in a triangle and it makes a circle. It depends on each other. It's starting with data minimalism. Only share data on case of needs to know. Don't keep the whole data set, share it. Because AI can find it. And if it is stored on 3 or 4 or 5 places, you have to secure all those places. And if it is only stored on one place, you only have to secure it on one place. And also keep it up and back it up from one place. Okay, so it's all about awareness, the people, building the processes around it, and build a strategy above it. 2-3 years ago, I think everybody said, "Oh, we're safe. We are in 365." But yeah, with the geopolitical things that are going around now, yeah, we all scratch on our heads. Is it good? Is it not good?
Right.
Yeah, and yeah, data portability. We have to pick it up and move it somewhere else. Yeah, it must be able. It must be able. We have to reply on jurisdictions. We have to. If there is an answer, a question, we have to reply that data. We have to make governance for several years. So it becomes quite complex in our organization. And keeping up with it, yeah, it's a real heavy job.
Yeah, and I know I did a webinar earlier this year with our own Vice President of Governance, Risk, and Compliance, and we looked at some reports of just the scale of how complex it can be to keep up with all of these requirements, these jurisdictional requirements. And she mentioned that in this report, on average, any given organization has 1.5 people to manage all of the regulatory compliance pieces within that CISO organization. I'm sure you don't have 1.5 within your organization to cover this, right? So that concept of complexity, I think, is a lot of what's top of mind. And that brings us, I think, to the next point, which is talking about legal jurisdiction, regulatory compliance, and just how big, how massive this is becoming for organizations to try to tackle. And Edwin, at least it sounds like not a multinational organization, right? You're focused just on your own sovereign area. But Archana, I think for a lot of organizations, they have to think about 5, 6, 7, 8 different jurisdictions, oftentimes more. And this has got to be a really complex issue.
Yeah, that's for sure. We manage the fire departments. We are public health. We are a crisis organization. We are a vital organization. Some processes of our organization are vital because, yeah, you have to rely on the fireworks. If there is a fire, if you call them, yeah, they should come. You have to rely on that. So we are still on a critical mission, and yeah, it's quite difficult. Regulations. We are government. It's a complex business. cybersecurity law that's coming around in the Netherlands, the NIS2, the DORA, change supply, which you have to have a focus on it, because we have to rely on some suppliers, because
Right.
If we cannot rely on them, we cannot do our jobs anymore. It's a quite complex structure.
Yep. And difficult to manage. Archana, do you want to cover a little bit about, like Edwin mentioned, some of those acronyms, DORA, NIST? It's getting even more complex than that. Do you want to talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Edwin is living it, right? And then we at IDC tried to look and capture all of the regulations and policies that are affecting EMEA organizations in 2025, and look at that chart, right? There are so many of them. It's like a candy store. And Ali, I like the term, I think when you and I have spoken on this topic, you use the word acronym soup, right? Which is, it's so hard to keep up. And I think we tried to look at which regulations are new and which are an update. And if you can see, there are a lot more blue dots than there are gray dots, which goes to show that there's a lot more newer stuff that organizations have to get their heads around. And I know there's a lot, right? And it can be overwhelming if it's just 1.5 person. As you said, that's quite shocking to me. I would have expected the GRC team to be a little bit bigger and to have a bit more budget on this side as well, and not just 2% of the overall IT budget, which just goes to nothing, which is what we've heard. But this idea, there's a lot to take in. So, and it's a monster of a problem to solve. But what organizations can do is take a step back and see the devil is not as much in the detail as it is in the direction. So look at the direction of travel for each of these regulations, right? What are they? What is the EU trying to tell organizations? I think it ultimately comes down to be resilient, go in with your eyes open so that you know what you're going to do, and have complete control of your data, your IP, as well as your operations, because that's your business. And if you look at, there are some enabling regulations, and there are some regulations around resilience and control. So there's always a balancing act that every C-suite executive has to do, and not tilt to one side completely, because then otherwise it's going to be difficult. You have to be seen as an innovator, and you have to embrace the public cloud environment for innovation. You have to have those SaaS environments. But then again, take a deeper look at your supply chain. It's gotten a lot more complex. It's a lot more intricate. So look at what your exposure points are, and what is your organization's risk appetite to address each of those. And in many cases, once you have clearer answer and you build that decision tree of what's important, look, I've made a classification. These are the workloads that these legal regulations apply, and these are so mission critical that we got to protect them. And then when you go to the stakeholders and approach them for budgets, you're going to get budget to attack these, right? So that would be a way to do that. And then looking at the direction of travel. So look at resilience. Start with GDPR. You already have it, but a lot of organizations looked at just minimum viable compliance and said, okay, we've gotten the regulator off our back, and now we can continue doing what we want to do. And they never revisited any of their policies, right? And that kind of approach, I think, is a risky one. So if you take, if you use regulations as a way forward to build a very trusted environment for you to flourish and innovate, then that's the way to do it. Then just do it in a digestible format, but look at the direction of travel, which is very much around resilience, control, and compliance, and take your steps forward from there. And the point is, if you start addressing 2 or 3 of these, I think there would be very few additional things that you may need to do to comply with other 4, right? So you may have 115 mechanisms in place for GDPR, and now you look at DORA as well. You think, okay, there are just 3 or 4 gaps. So instead of doing 170 new mechanisms in place, you just have to add on and build on. So having that documentation of what you have is also quite important.
Excellent advice. Like, that's definitely what we've been talking about with organizations as well, is a lot of these sound different, but there are common controls in place. And there are a lot of these that are moving in the same direction that just have different enforcement points, right? So when you cut through that noise, it's amazing how so much of it is still moving in the same direction. And Edwin and I actually had a chance earlier this year to take a look at the 2025 regulatory landscape and think about what thematically is being changed across the acronym soup that we're looking at. And we really came down to 4 pieces, which is we're seeing an increase in mandatory reporting when it comes to breach, right? You know, Edwin, M and us were joking before we started the webinar today, should I mention the breach? And he was like, well, you know, it's public. And I think that's going to continue to be more and more of an expectation and a requirement, even if you're not critical infrastructure like Edwin's organization is. Part of that is also time-bound incident response requirements. Now, this seems to still be a Herculean feat for a lot of organizations we talk to. In the United States, for example, there's proposals through HIPAA, which is the Healthcare Data Regulatory Organization. They want to reduce the time of incident response from like 3 weeks to days. And I don't know how most organizations are going to do that. We'll see if that passes. But those are the kinds of things that are being proposed. We're also seeing a lot of those common controls that I mentioned being reinforced. Do you have MFA enabled? Is there least privilege access with logical separation? We're all saying a lot of the same things. Now you're seeing more and more of those being introduced and enforced. That final piece Edwin mentioned earlier is the one that I want to focus on here, which is third-party risk mitigation. In that same webinar that I mentioned, we looked at this study and it said on average, any given enterprise sends data to 583 different vendors. Are all of them mission critical to your supply chain? Maybe not, but unless you have all of the architecture schemas written out so that you know where the dependencies are, it just sounds like a complex knot that we need to be tackling. And I think especially you guys have heard every speaker today mention vendor lock-in and vendor lock-out. That has been a big topic of conversation for the Veeam team as well. We really pride ourselves on being the least prescriptive vendor in our category. If you want SaaS, we have it. If you want an appliance, we just started announcing that that might be an option. But we also have software-only solutions so that you have the maximum control. And it boils down a lot to what you're seeing on the screen. So many organizations, when they're thinking about vendors, are faced with limited flexibility, high switching costs. We've spoken a lot in this industry about the Broadcom acquisition of VMware, and our research has told us that a lot of organizations are reducing their investment in VMware, but it would be so cost prohibitive to completely rip out a lot of these systems and re-architect them. So most aren't going to do that. That makes you really locked into that platform. By the same extension, we're now seeing lockout become more and more important, as we've said, thinking about data ownership, thinking about contracts and whether or not you want to sign a 5-year agreement given the geopolitical changes that we're all experiencing. So I think this will hopefully give everyone in the audience some things to think about as they look at their organization's approach to third-party relationships. And part of that, I think, brings us to the next topic, which is on the technical side. How do you think about portability being baked into these environments? And it's really important that we do that as we're looking at making purchasing decisions, because you have a data estate today and investments today, but your organization gets to make decisions tomorrow, 2026 budgeting, et cetera. So Archana, why don't you talk a little bit about some of those spending trends that we're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, we've been tracking IT spend since COVID times, because that's when it started to become a lot more dynamic. And wave after wave, we are seeing when it comes to IT spend priorities, there are a couple of domains that remain immune to budget cuts, regardless of how much pressure there is in terms of IT budgets. And the 3 areas are AI and automation. That's that's one domain that's immune to budget cuts because it's coming from line of business. There's newer budgets assigned to AI because all C-suite executives seem to have FOMO and now are chasing the agentic AI dream as well. So AI and automation. And the second one is very much the security, risk, and compliance, right? I mean, we've highlighted cybersecurity. There are so many aspects around that the risks around business continuity, loss of trust, and that whole compliance and risk and security is becoming number two. So it's one of the other areas that's immune to budget cuts. And the third one is very much about modernization, right? A lot of that lock-in that you were talking about is also coming in from that technical debt. Like, I've built in so much of technical debt into this environment. It's just very hard for me to get out of it. And I have all the skills tied into that environment as well. And when I say infrastructure modernization, I include cloud in that, right? A lot of organizations are thinking about their cloud modernization as well, where they are trying to be intentionally hybrid cloud, where there is a lot more interoperability and data portability. They may not necessarily move an application every 6 months, but they just want to have an architecture where it's really possible to move strategic applications from one environment to another without breaking your back in terms of skills or breaking your bank in terms of the cost it takes to do that. So infrastructure modernization is another way that organizations see as not only useful for progressing in the AI and automation and minimizing those security risks, but also to make sure that they are a lot more resilient and have a very fluid architecture, thinking more like a fabric instead of a very set infrastructure. And that's where a lot of IT spend is. But then, so this idea that organizations have to balance innovation and security is very real, and that's seen in terms of the IT spend priorities. But then there's a lot of politics involved in this as well, and it really depends on the chief executive's predominant, like which way predisposition as well, right? If they are more innovation friendly, then they're going to look at that piece more and let the other two legs of the stool fall a bit. So it depends on where organizations are, but the most savvy ones are actually able to balance all of this a lot more better.
And I think that's one of those things. Can you go back on slightly, yeah? About those 3 pillars. A lot of them, I don't know how you have seen that in the market, but a lot focus just on the first one. And they all completely forget about the security, risk, and compliance with the data flowing through AI. And then all of a sudden, some people behind are like, you want to run that on something, right? And we have a data center, we need power in that. And we also have some challenges there. What about that one? And the right ones balance those 3 and try to figure out, okay, how can we do it secure? How can we make sure that the infrastructure can run it? But yeah, that's kind of a challenge. So hopefully we'll see that more and more people get those 3 together instead of just focusing on the first one. But yeah, it's great to see that those 3 are on the bucket list for everyone to spend money on for the next 12 months there.
Exactly, spot on, right, Edwin? I think that's what we are seeing, and what we call it is a POC jail. So organizations have all these fancy ideas about AI and create 50 POCs, and then they are stuck in that impasse. They're not able to take that to production because the GRC guys are beginning to ask, hey, have you thought about this? And the CFO is beginning to ask, hey, have you forecasted the cost for it? And they have no idea, right? So they're stuck in this POC jail and not able to take that to production. So it's very important to look at it a lot more holistically.
I'm laughing so hard right now because I have a friend who is literally going through exactly what you just described right now. And I like, on the one hand, I get his pain, but on the other hand, I'm like, I don't know, I value things like data privacy and our company not getting sued or whatever, right? So yeah, it's got to be that balance of risk appetite, risk exposure. And I think there's so many technical things that can be done to limit that risk exposure while letting everyone out of POC jail. So hopefully we'll keep seeing that evolve as the year progresses too. Now, a lot of that anxiety comes from business risks. So why don't you kind of outline some of those here?
Yeah, I think this is the slide speaks for itself, right? We've been looking at multiple different business risks for a very long time, and tariff and trade wars. It's all very topical, and this is the first time that this idea of geopolitical tensions has stayed as number one consistently for multiple waves in our Enterprise Infrastructure Pulse survey. So it's by far cited by nearly 38% of organizations, right, compared to all the others, which is very fragmented. So that risk is the most real, and that directly connects to this idea of sovereignty. I mean, some people debate about the term sovereignty itself, right? When it's just such a loaded term, but then ultimately you think about your risk, and that's what it is. It ultimately comes down to risk. So this geopolitical conflicts and tensions, you need to look at your entire enterprise architecture and identify what those risk points are and how you want to mitigate it as well. And some of them like to take a wait and see approach, but it can be a very risky strategy because you never know when anything will break or when you might have state-sponsored cyber attack. You just have to be prepared, right? And you see a lot of preparation among organizations that take it seriously. Like if you talk to UN, you talk to NATO, they get these risks and they have put in mechanisms in place. So it's very much possible to address some of these risks, but you have to be incredibly clear on what those priorities are and be willing to make those trade-offs. You can't have everything, right? So you need to be willing to make those trade-offs.
And I think especially for EMEA organizations, right, that's even more prevalent than maybe it is in the United States, where a lot of these companies are headquartered.
Yeah, absolutely. So we particularly asked EMEA organizations, like you've identified these as your geopolitical uncertainties as one of your biggest business risks. So what are you doing about this, right? Are you really walking the talk? And if you look at organizations and what they're doing, they've classified their workloads. And when it comes to most critical workloads, that's their business, right? If that goes down, business goes down. So they've identified those. And they've said they have expedited purchasing activity, which goes to show maturity, particularly in that critical workload space where they are trying to hedge some of their risks, mitigate some of the risks, identify, like have multiple environments running those same workloads to make sure if one goes down, the other stays up. And it's quite important, right? It's a bit like insurance. It's never going to help an organization's say Baskin-Robbins sell more ice cream, but it's quite important for them to stay in business. And if you're going to only invest in systems that's going to help you sell more ice cream, then that's all you're focused on. You just don't have a fallback if something goes wrong. So it's very important to look at this and say that risk mitigation is as important as investing in something that will help me increase my bottom line. But a lot of organizations are still very much early in their journey when it comes to all of their other workloads, like their even business critical or business essential workloads, where they are looking at going hybrid cloud, but that's a multi-year journey. So the ones that have actually made those decisions and expedited the purchasing activities are the ones who are a lot more clearer and more mature. But that's happening only at a critical workload level. And for a lot of banking organizations, they look at their entire application estate and say, look, it's okay if my customer is not able to view their bank balance on their app when they're on holiday, but it's not okay if they're not able to use their credit card. So then which is an important workload for me? That workload, I'm going to make sure I have proper redundancy, geo-redundancy in place, proper mechanism when it comes to backup and all of it. So I create multiple layers of resilience for that particular workload. So sovereignty doesn't require you to boil the entire ocean. Start with your most critical workloads when your budgets are limited and address those first. So you as an organization can operate on a lean and mean basis and then build it out as you go further.
We've definitely seen that in working with organizations in the field, that financial services, healthcare, they tend to be much more mature in data resilience because there's such a clarity to the importance of various applications and workflows. And of course, there's additional regulatory requirements in those verticals. So you definitely see that there. But when we look at what those kinds of organizations are doing, not just technically, but across the board, we find that they really have a holistic buy-in across data strategy, people and process, and it's not just workloads that sit in the data center that the data center guys are managing. They're now thinking about SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, all of it together. And Edwin, I know when you're in the field talking a bit with organizations, especially at that VP and C level area, backup can feel like a very basement level priority, but I think we've gotten in a good rhythm now of thinking about everything more holistically and especially injecting that portability story into the overall landscape of how we approach data resilience. So do you want to talk a bit about kind of how we go after people and process data strategy conversations in addition to the technical ones?
Yeah, Leah. Especially when it comes to compliance, a lot of people will complain that there's. We've seen the slides from Arcana. It's like that middle one, and it's like boiling. That acronym soup. But that's kind of the point, and people are focusing on which one should they focus on. It's like, okay, hold on, turn it around. Think about that as the bare minimum. That's the bare minimum you should look at. But that's kind of the baseline that's being created. You should be above the baseline. So build that resilient organization. And how can you build a resilient organization? By having portability by design in there. And by having portability, that means that you can pick up. So if something changes, you don't want your data in a particular area, you want it somewhere else because of geopolitics, because of finance, some other things that move around. Maybe your organization is buying another organization, and all of a sudden you have to rethink things. So that's all about strategy. That's also why I say this is a strategy point. That's also why you will see it out in data strategy. Okay, where is your data? How are we going to get it in? What's regulatory around that data? But also means you have to have insights in the data. And that's where we kind of lack all over the world, having insights in the whole data flow. So from cradle to grave, that whole life cycle. And in that life cycle, we have some obligations, as I call them. You have to secure the data. You have to make sure that the data is only accessible by particular means, particular persons, but also particular applications. Especially when AI comes in, they normally say, give it everything. Think about giving information to your 5-year-old child, and you give it every information you have. How do you think when they become teenager, how are they going to react? Most likely people will start laughing now at the screen. Yeah, I know, but that's the whole thing. When we're now in that AI phase, because we have a toddler on our hands, and everything we tell and teach the toddler, we will get it back in like a couple of years now. And that's why we really have to think about that business impact analysis effort there.
You know what, Edwin, I heard of a really interesting research report that came out the other day. If you had to guess, how many bad documents would it take to corrupt a large language model? How many documents do you think it would take?
I can even corrupt it with 3 questions.
Right. Well, this research found that it was just 250 documents.
There you go.
250. So to Edwin's point, throwing everything in the kitchen sink indiscriminately is a really fast way to ruin some good investments, and you have to start from square one. Not that that's necessarily related to data sovereignty, but again, it just shows how fragile so many of these critical investments are. And if that's at the top of your IT spending budget, what are you doing to protect that investment? It has to come down to a lot of the same principles that we're talking about here with portability, sovereignty, and resilience.
Yeah, that's also the people process. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just what Ankara also already said. Just don't start boiling the whole ocean. Just start with a small bucket, but your most important bucket. It's like triage, but upside down. Start with your most important things and build it up. Get in control and get more mature. That will be the strategy. Start small and build it out. The world is even also not built in one day. You cannot do it all together, and you have to do it with all together with your people. So get in control, make a strategy about it, build processes and improve yourself. And if you are going in control, you're going to self-optimization, and that's the stairs up to a maturity model. And yeah, that's the way how you get in control. Are we there yet? No, we are continuous improvement. Yeah.
And that's also what I like, Edwin, because I know your organization, we talk a lot. It's about taking those small steps, those steps forward. But you have to have a strategy there. If you don't have a strategy, you have no clue where you end up. Might be fun because you can come into some places where you shouldn't be, but that's not the point where you're running a business, because that's all about the risk appetite. So you want to know which steps to take to go forward to that point on the horizon. That's also why I help organizations say it's about people using processes, and processes are being supported by technology, not the other way around. If you start buying technology, then changing processes and forcing it on people, well, bad mistake. And you will see that people don't handle change really well. And all of that is being fueled by data. That's also why we have the data strategy on the left, people and process in the mid, and then technical controls at that moment in time. Because if you know your strategy, you know how your people and processes are working, it's so easy to fit in the right technical controls. And one of those technical controls is thinking about strategy about portability. How can you pick something up and track it somewhere else? That's also why that's so important to have that flow in the right way. And then being compliant is quite easy. I've seen verticals, and Leah, you talked about like the banking, so financial and healthcare. They have been under auditing, and if we ask Andrew Trotsky, our field CISO, he will start laughing already now, because they have been on auditing for like decades already. They are quite mature in handling the process about compliance. But also, if you look through the financial institutes who are thriving, are the ones seeing it as a bare minimum. That's their baseline. Let's go above and beyond. Let's be ahead of the curve, because you want to have that resilient organization that can handle anything, and also the things that we haven't spoken about or we don't know yet about. And things will change, geopolitics change, or better said, politics always change. So that landscape is like reforming every day. And the same what we get from like business perspective. We don't just change the business. If we have an ice cream factory, we don't start doing waffles all of a sudden. But yeah, that could be the case. So we know our business, and let's make sure that we cut down the noise that's around it by having a solid strategy.
Cut down the noise. I think that's the headline, right? How do we cut down the noise? Because we gave you a lot of boogeymen to be worried about, but this is all achievable. And as the other Edwin mentioned, his organization is not there yet and probably never will be, because there will be another boogeyman that comes up. But bringing that posture together, bringing the processes together is really that way forward. We were going to talk about this anyway, so I think this is great. This is what maturity in action looks like, right? Cutting through the noise, being okay with a certain level of risk, but recognizing that it takes that continuous level of improvement. And I think a big building block is really looking at the core principles of data protection, the things that nerds like Edwin and I have talked about for decades now when it comes to backup and infrastructure stability. That's now becoming this strategic level of importance. So Archana, why don't you talk to us a bit about why it's maybe not surprising to us, but something for the audience to recognize that that level of protection is still top of mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, when I was looking at, the data protection status of M365, particularly after organizations said they are very concerned about data loss in that environment, a lot of them use it. It really made me a bit cross and look at it in disbelief and go back to my data one more time and go and check with the survey team to make sure, did we capture this right? I mean, look at the number of organizations, whether it's worldwide, whether it's EMEA, where the fear of sovereignty is a lot higher. Look how many of them are depending on native data protection. This is the bare minimum that you can do to become resilient, right? So nearly 60% of organizations, that is, which have cited that they rely on SaaS vendor provided data protection, which means they are keeping their car keys in their car. Right? And then how are you going to protect yourself? And then look, doing nothing is not an option. And for a lot of organizations, there is so much of passion that runs when they talk about sovereignty and how important it is, but then they're not necessarily walking the talk and not even taking those baby steps, right? Both the Edwins here have talked about how it's important to make a start. You can do it bit by bit, but making a start is not an option, it's an imperative. It's very important. And data protection is the absolute basic starting point for organizations to think about mitigating some of their risk exposure to SaaS environments. So I'm hoping next year when we run this again in August 2026, the numbers would have flipped somewhat if organizations are very serious about data sovereignty and not just like one of those fancy risk reporting, right, where they report, for auditing team, they write a big risk report and then their bosses come in and say, my goodness, that's ludicrous. We can never run a business, right? So do something about it. And then they are massaging that data and they just make it look less risky, but the actual risk isn't changing. It's just that how you're telling a story is very different. So make sure you're telling a very balanced story within your organization, because those risk exposure points are very real, and when they bite hard. It may be business as usual every day, but you never know what happens to your organization. So being prepared is very important, and that backup is absolute basic bare minimum that you got to do. So I hope to see this changed. And hopefully that will change, because when we looked at the budget plans, 77% of organizations said that they are looking to increase their SaaS data protection budgets in the next 12 months. And 87% of mature industries expect to increase their SaaS data protection budgets. So it's going in the right direction, but I am still in a bit of a disbelief that not many organizations are aware of the risks, particularly when they are so keen to talk about sovereignty. So it's back on them. And yeah, I think the last point I want to make is very much about, it's a big topic, it's multi-layered, it's multi-dimensional, it's emotive, it's contentious, but ask a few questions, and you address some of this early on as well, right? Data residency, is that enough? It's where your data is located is just that, it's data residency. If the provider that you're using still comes under the jurisdiction of another country, your data is not very much in your control, right? So ask the right questions and build it in layers. You need backup, you need encryption, you need if infrastructure is what you're doing, you need confidential computing, you need multiple different tools, you need data classification tools. All of that come together to address those risks around having more resilience and control. And what lens are you taking? Is it a compliance lens? Then maybe you are approaching it from very much like, what is the bare minimum I can do? And I am compliant with GDPR, that's all I care about, because the other regulations are coming in 6 months later, and then I will have another 18 months to prepare. So I have like that 2 years to prepare for that. So if you're taking a compliance lens versus those that are taking a business risk lens, are slightly further ahead in being a bit more prepared. And the last one is, what exactly are you optimizing your business for? Do you want convenience, immediate convenience? That's very tactical. It's okay to go down that way, but then you have to be clear that if these risks come, I'm prepared to face it. Or are you optimizing for long-term control, strategic control? And these answers to these questions will guide you into that sovereignty funnel to make sure you're taking the right steps.
Yeah, and I think, you broke it down really beautifully, because this isn't in the States, we have a phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This isn't one of those, right? This isn't a let's all rubber band and do 100% open source that sits on premises. Everything has to be that level of trade-off. So it just comes down to being aware of where your risk exposure is. And, I know one of the things we're going to talk about here is how to identify that risk exposure. One other plug I'll make is that most vendors, most third-party vendors, they have a trust center. They have somewhere where all of their commitments and policies are written down and set. And it is more than just GDPR requirements, right? That is just the bare minimum. It should be listing things out like, here's our commitment to where your data will be. Here's our commitment to data exfiltration, should you want that. Here's who has access to it, where our support offices are. Here's the Chinese walls that we're putting in place to protect that data internally, right? A lot of that is listed in vendor trust centers. So I highly encourage everyone to take a look at those, including Veeam's. That's part of why Edwin and I get passionate about it, is our own trust center has been dramatically built out over the last 2 years. There's so much good information there. But the other piece of it, again, is if you're going to have data being sent to 583 different vendors, the answer is maybe not to contract that number of vendors, because that might be impossible, and instead to just assume sprawl in the same way that we assume breach, and think about data management capabilities writ large. So, Archana and Edwin W, especially, I'd love for you guys to kind of talk about this as our last piece before we wrap.
Yeah, I think when we asked organizations, what are your desired capabilities when it comes to data management on a scale of 1 to 5, you look at identification and classification, data protection and governance, they all got more than a rating of 4. So it's extremely important for them, followed by data security. And each of these are complementary to each other, and organizations have to build this in layers, and data security will be your access control, and all of that will be effective if you actually have proper data identification and classification and protection in place, right? So it's multiple different layers you need. And looks like identification and classification was one of those areas that was a little bit ignored. A lot of organizations have overinvested in terms of individual security tools around data security, and very little on other strategic aspects. And now they're waking up to this fact. So I think we will see a lot more investment in data classification, because if you don't know what you're protecting, how do you know what level of protection to apply? So that's very much the first step, and that's what we're beginning to see.
Yeah, I always group those on the screen in one term: know your data. Who's accessing it? Where is it stored? What do you want to achieve with it? So know your data.
Know your data. Know your data. Have a plan for how it's going to be protected, how it's going to be portable. Veeam, as we said, is the least prescriptive vendor when it comes to data protection. So we always want to give those options. If you're in the boat where SaaS does make sense for you, you want the turnkey, you want the simple, you want the immediate return, you can learn more about our own SaaS solution, Veeam Data Cloud. And of course, all of the relevant information is listed on our Trust Center, so you know exactly what you're getting into, what your risk exposure is. You can take a look at a demo with us as well. But the thing that I'm really excited to share is that we have a launch event coming up where we're going to be talking a lot about what Veeam is bringing to market, given all of these market trends. And a big one that we are excited to talk about is we have announced the intent to purchase a DPSM solution called Security. And the security team is going to be all over this online event. So if you guys want to learn more about data classification and what our vision is for how data classification comes into data resilience and data sovereignty, you should check out this launch event. QR code is on the screen there. We'll make sure to send this out along with the slides to everyone as well. We are going to go ahead and stay on the chat to answer any additional questions. I know we ran long, so thank you guys so much in the audience for sticking with us. Hopefully we can answer your questions here. If not, all of us are on LinkedIn. We're happy to connect with you guys one-on-one and share. The Edwins, if you guys are in the Netherlands, I think they're going to have a pub night sometime soon. So if you want to have drinks with those guys, you're more than welcome to. And otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure. And thank you to my panel. You guys have been excellent, and I look forward to doing something else like this in the near future. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds great. Thank you.